Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this narration of the web series The Lost Terran. If you are new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 11. It had been 15 minutes since Rix and Reggie had departed, and Munter was still a mess. The walking frame was confining, and the secondary waste disposal system of the Esperanto was annoyingly dumb. It worked and was just as overbuilt as the rest of the vessel, but that was all it did. No extra sub-processors, no obvious network protocols that would tell Munter more about the Terran or the TSC beyond the little that Munter still had cached from the TSC database. True to his words, Rix had managed to get a scroll talking to the printer, but Munter could tell that the printer wasn't happy about it. Munter still was displeased with how the graphical interface worked, and because they didn't have the right receivers to try and connect directly via the remote desktop protocol, they were stuck using a mixture of voice controls and the graphical interface to manipulate the default template into some semblance of adapter that the comparatively clumsy Terran could fit so that Munter wasn't so restricted. The charge of the walking frame was slowly creeping up, but Munter was preoccupied with getting the adapters fitted. The sooner the Terran was able to produce their own power, the less risk to both vessels because of lack of energy systems aboard Munter's, self. It was hard for Munter to consider that they were not separated from themselves. It had happened initially with the walking frame, but that had been a mere temporary disruption, and walking frames weren't unheard of to be lost when exploring. No, it was having been removed and disconnected from themselves that bothered Munter the most. The closest organic equivalent that Munter could think of would be the removal of the head from the body, the head still living, and the body simply existing. Munter wanted to see themselves via the augmented ocular sensors of one of the appendages of the walking frame, but that would have to wait. The walking frame was still charging, and the printer was not being cooperative about accepting the modified template. It was at this point that Rix came in. "Any luck?" he asked.
"Limited thus far, but I believe that I have drafted an updated template. The printer is not wishing to accept a template, though," Munter said, looking at the Terran.
"Oh yeah, I figured that out. You just have to long press the command to get override going. Not sure why your printer wants it like that, but any non-standard template, it wants some sort of extra confirmation," Rick said, wrapping a hand at the scroll. Munter tried this, and the print command went through this time.
"That is not the intended operation of the system. I'm uncertain as to why it is behaving that way,"
Munter commented. "It's probably the heuristic refining built into the scrolls. Slowly changes the controls based on the use of the system. It's pretty used to the way I use it, so it probably figured that that's how I wanted it to handle the data," Rick shrugged. Munter glanced between the scroll and the Terran.
"I doubt that explanation, but I will accept it at face value until a better and more logical explanation is available," Munter said.
"Back to sounding like a machine again," Rix remarked.
"And you whine like an organic,"
Munter retorted, taking a full second to see if this interaction tactic would help matters. Rix's head spun around, and a curious look took over his features. He began to cough, making a kind of heavy breathing sound, similar to how the Terran chuckled, but much more involved and far less voluntary. After approximately 10 seconds, it subsided, and Rix looked back at Munter. "And you're getting to be more Terran by the minute. I'll admit, I had my doubts when I first met you. I wouldn't have believed that you were of Terran construction as you were, but I can believe it now," Rix said, sitting down. Munter thought about this.
"For what reason did you have suspicions otherwise?"
Munter prompted. "I just couldn't believe that they'd designed non-homicidal artificials without a sense of humor. But I figured maybe it was a kind of holdover, like something from the military," Rick said, gesturing vaguely. Munter checked the lexicon for what military meant for a Terran and was, less than thrilled. Martial might was, even more than toilet humor, highly central to Terran cultures. This was not to say that it was obviously wholly representative, but it featured entire subsections of the lexicon and what little of the TSC database that was cached, but which Munter hadn't actively processed. And while they should be taking offense at the suggestion of an artificial being involved in the termination of other sentience, Munter let it pass. There was undoubtedly some longer cultural connotations on that regard, which they would have to have Rix explain.
"Given the construction of the first tacit was from a military vessel, I can see where that wouldn't be a reasonable assumption. But I would advise you to caution future conversations with other tacits. Most are likely to consider your comments on the verge of speciesism."
Munter recalled their own shock at the comparison. "Really? What did they build it out of?" Rix perked up a bit.
a TSC cruiser-class vessel, as you previously identified, Monto said.
Did I?
You clearly stated that you believe the first tacet to have been larger than a cruiser vessel. I used the data, along with the TSC database at the time, to compare dimensions, and they overlay significantly, allowing for deviations where the tacet was added to the vessel.
Monto replayed the memory and fast-forward in their conversation. Wow, lucky guess on my part. Any idea what the name was before it got converted? Rix asked.
I do not know. The information was not obviously listed in the files when I searched, and I would not have found the data useful if I had, Monto said.
I wonder if it was still active after all of this. Rix's eyes seemed to glaze slightly as he looked towards the ceiling.
It is highly doubtful, Monto replied.
Rix's eyes refocused. Why is that?
His face blank. Tacets have a maximum allotted lifespan of 400 years. At that point in time, they are to submit for storage and their formulations examined for future formulations as a means for continual improvement and knowledge databasing,
Monto said, this being standard knowledge. But why? Do you start having issues at 401 years old? Rix looked slightly amused.
There is a correlation with operational efficiency degradation at the point of greater than 500 years of continual operation. In order to avoid risk to both the tacets and the galactic community, as well as to ensure that best practices are recorded and included in long-term formulations, it is necessary for tacets to be retired accordingly,
Monto explained. Rix seemed somewhat alarmed at this, but wasn't saying anything. So, no matter what condition you're in, at 400 years, you're hauled into a shop and broken down for inspection and parts, he asked, his voice sad.
That is correct. It is a reasonable form of operation which balances the generations of new tacets with the experience of older tacets,
Monto said, seeing the logic having been formulated from the knowledge of retired tacets and expected to contribute to future generations. But what if you want to exist longer? How much is that degradation? Rix pressed.
Why would a tacet resist sharing themselves with future tacets?
Monto questioned back, the thought seeming backwards. Well, why couldn't they learn from each other by interacting?
Of what benefit would that be over retirement and inclusion with future formulations?
Monto tried to consider the logistics involved in supporting aging tacets. The old ones would have to die just for their wisdom to be passed on. And what if there's something that gets missed for inclusion? Something that wasn't supposed to get included does. Like that issue that you were having with the blocks, whatever that issue was, Rix continued.
I do not see where those two issues align. Please explain.
Monto was starting to see a logic thread, but wanted to hear the Terran's point of view. It's like say for some reason you couldn't manipulate any object the size of this container, Rix said, grabbing one of the empty containers from his and Reggie's meal. And then say that this continues with your whole time and it becomes a blind spot for you because you just can't handle or do anything with something that's size. You get retired and that blind spot goes into the formulations for future tacets, not because of anything malicious, but it happens. Now you have more tacets who've developed a blind spot for these size objects, and it just keeps going, until all tacets can't or won't deal with objects this size, through no fault of their own. Rix laid out the logic path. It was a path of inheritance that Monto hadn't considered, and it certainly was one that could be applied to the parents' blue spectrum issue that they had noticed. Except there was a flaw in the Terran's logic.
Except that formulations are scrupulously reviewed for flaws prior to implementation,
Monto countered. But what if one got through? Would it get flagged if it was in 1 or 20 tacets already? Rix pressed.
Unlikely, but it is more likely that the manufacturer would have needed to pre-select for that to be part of the formulation, Monto replied.
Unless the manufacturer is based off of a hand-off logic in handling formulation traits and doesn't look to down-select unless there's a major issue which results, like birth defects that trigger within the first 100 years or so. Maybe not even that long. Rix's argument seemed to carry more and more weight. Part of the problem with being artificial is that you don't down-select based on evolutionary traits like organics do, at least not in the same way. It becomes a potential for weakness. Monto had never considered it like that. Hearing the Terran's argument, it made sense, but at the same time it dealt with the process that Monto had never been involved in and would never be involved with. It was a segmented part of tacet life that was entirely separated from normal operations. In theory, it governed tacet culture, except without actually actively governing it. And Rix's comment about it being a potential for weakness seemed adversarial.
How is it a potential for weakness?
Monto asked. People, non-artificials, they select based on protocols associated with cultures and biologies.
Sometimes it's conscious, other times it isn't. But the end goal is the same. Adequate resources and the continuation of the species, Rix explained. I believe I am understanding the path of logic, but I would appreciate additional information, interjected Mondo. Successful continuation of a species requires adaptation to various pressures, be it social or biological. For Terrans, this can be made at any stage of life after, development, Rick said, rather more deliberately. You're sounding like less yourself, Mondo remarked. It's all part of school, and while I remember it, it's not something that I ever really was good at. I just, remember the words in the context, and I may have dated the xenobiology student at one point. Rick shrugged. She, talked about it. A lot. And for a species that does not cease functions at this reproduction, this is the most common to influence the selections of others, despite having already contributed, Mondo queried. Exactly. And just because someone doesn't reproduce doesn't mean that they aren't contributing either. It's all part of the social pressures taking effect. But from the way you make tacit sound, it's like having it all rolled into one, but requiring the cessation of function for it to happen. Terra used to have fish that did the same sort of thing. Rix waved the hands almost a bit wildly. So, your objection is to my species following the given path because we have found it to work best for us instead of following the path that your species found works best, Mondo tried. Rix's hand froze mid-wave, and his whole body seemed to slump slightly in his seat. His face was a picture of thought. Well, when you put it like that, yeah, I guess it shouldn't make sense to me then. I don't know. I guess I figured that maybe you'd be more like Terrans instead of like, your own thing, Rix said slowly. It is a worthwhile thought experiment, but I would argue that you cannot consider us to always be like you, Mondo tactfully added. I suppose not. I guess I've got a lot of learning to do, Rix nodded, but at least I can still pilot. A moment or two paused before Mondo answered. Nominally, piloting is still a skill that some species choose to use. Many rely on automated systems with limited supervision, Mondo said plainly. What about for going places that no one has been to? What about for emergencies? Rix asked. Where's the fun and adventure gone? Unknown. As I've said before, I don't deal with organics typically, so I am unable to answer your questions until I am able to reconnect. And speaking of which, the connectors are finished printing, Mondo answered. What's your charge level looking like? Rix looked at the walking frame directly this time. Still slow. We should prioritize getting me connected to the Esperanto. I suspect we'll have a need for your fusion system sooner rather than later, Mondo said. Why is that? Rix seemed surprised. My automated mass feed is offline, and the lack of networking aboard myself, the power systems have only a set amount of reaction mass available, Mondo explained, feeling it odd to have to do so. How long do we have? Rix was on his feet in an instant. I do not know. It will depend on the consumption rate. As the vessel has been largely an idle except for the engines and the draw from this vessel, it is difficult to calculate without being connected. Mondo had the walking frame attempt to shrug, and only partially succeeded in making the frame bounce slightly in place. I'll get the stuff. If there's one thing I don't want to be low on, it's power. Everything else I can solve with time and you, Rix said, moving with surprising speed out the room. Mondo sat there with the walking frame and contemplated the battery charge levels slowly creeping upwards. It wouldn't be much, but it would at least let them make sure that the Terran didn't mess with the plugs too badly. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrekahl, Dragzoon W.R.E, Holly's sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.